Hi, everyone. Welcome to Riverside Insights summer webinar conversations called For Educators by Educators. My name is Anna Hausman, and I'm the Group Product Marketing Director here at Riverside Insights. And we are so excited to spend the next couple of minutes talking with you all today about social emotional learning, student well-being, and how to make sure you're supporting the whole child in the classroom. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick introduction if you're first time joining us for the summer webinar series on what we're doing with For Educators by Educators. So we are running a series of conversations about hot topics that are front and center to educators in the classroom. We are pulling in people from Riverside Insights that have had classroom experience, and they're going to get to share some of their best practices and their expertise on what they did in the classroom or the district level and how it played out for them and for their students. So this is by no means a product-specific webinar. We are just here to talk about real topics that are impacting real students and real educators on a daily basis in the classroom. So we're so excited you're joining us. So today we have a stellar lineup of Riverside Insights employees here to talk to you about addressing external influences in social emotional learning, which we know is front and center to every educator's mind right now, especially coming off of 2 years of the pandemic. So in just a short moment, I'll have Ashley, Kendall, and Tina introduce themselves and share a little bit about their experience, and then we'll kick off the conversation shortly after that. But we are really excited to have these educators here with us today. And we hope that this can be a collaborative discussion as well. So please, throughout the conversation, please drop questions, comments into the chat. Would love to engage, your insights and your ideas as well to make this as collaborative as possible. Really quickly, this is the fourth one of our series of For Educators by Educators conversations, and we have 3 more coming up in the next 3 weeks. So next week will be a topic on being creative and amplifying student potential. Then following will be building the bridge between special ed and gen ed. And then the final topic will be advancing equity in your classrooms. So if these are topics that are of interest to you, please definitely sign up and join. Even if you're unable to join them live, we will send out the recordings after. And then finally, if you have missed one of our sessions that we've had in the past couple of weeks, all of the recordings are located on the Riverside Insights website. If you go to the Riverside Insights website and click on webinars and events, you'll be able to see our previous recordings, or head to our YouTube channel where you'll also be able to see some of the previous recordings. So hopefully that'll give you access to some of the conversations that we've talked about before. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see these lovely people's faces. And without further ado, would love to kick it off to our panelists today and hear who they are, where they're coming from, and their education background, and why they care about social emotional learning. Ashley, would you mind kicking it off for us?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Florek. I am the Customer Experience Manager here at Riverside. So if you are reaching out to us through one of our contact channels, you're most likely speaking to a member of our team. I previously taught early childhood in a district that offered universal pre-K, and I also served as the ECE grade level chairperson. And why I care about this topic, I would say, especially in pre-K, SEL is heavily integrated into early childhood best practices, right? So concepts such as sharing, being responsive to each other's emotions, and taking time to self-reflect naturally occur in early childhood. And given what was happening outside of school for many of my students, though, I also quickly learned that I had to be responsive to what students were facing at home and adapt the day's lesson plans accordingly. And so on some days when my young students were facing external stresses, the most important achievement for that day was to help them feel that they were loved and secure in the classroom setting. And sometimes that meant not getting to 100% of planned content on a given day, but that was okay because we were able to instead focus on some of those key social emotional learning objectives. So to me, it's like a key part of the school experience.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, Ashley. And I'm excited to dive into that later on, because without having that solid foundation, you are unable, I don't think, to unlock a student's full potential for growth. that foundation has to be in place, especially at the early childhood level. So thank you so much for sharing that. Before I kick it over to Tina, one thing I forgot, while Tina and Kendall are introducing themselves, for any of our participants online, if you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat, we'd love to hear who you are and what you are currently doing in your SEL programs. So what SEL programs you currently have, whether you have an assessment or a curriculum in place, and then how you are supporting the social emotional learning in your school or in your district. So drop that in the chat, and then we'll call some of those out in just a second. But Tina, would you mind introducing yourself? I'm sorry, not yourselves.
My name is Christina Jordan, and I am a National Academic Advisor here at Riverside. So I work with sales and marketing on the product team to help with sales enablement and working with customers as well. So I was a classroom teacher for 25 years at the elementary school level, and my graduate work is actually in psychology. So SEL has been a part of my professional life since the very beginning. Most of my work when I was in grad school focused on post-traumatic stress in students and in children and adolescents. And so I've sort of been diving into this topic for a really long time. Like Ashley said, I really think that this is something that as educators, we've always woven into our curriculum, making sure that our students have the emotional strength and capability to be flexible, to be kind, to be welcoming. All of those things are just good practices as a human, right? So, it's always been part of my educational path. I worked in an area where my students were dealing with some pretty big social challenges. Most of my students were living below the poverty level. A lot of my students were coming from refugee camps in other parts of the world. So they had a lot of real life issues that they were dealing with. So like Ashley said, sometimes we had to pivot, sometimes we had to be flexible, sometimes all we did was address social emotional well-being, and it was part of our school culture to make sure that not only our students but our staff felt connected and felt like they had the resources they needed to be strong individuals.
Thank you so much, Tina. Really excited to get some of your expertise and best practices shortly. And then finally, Kendall.
Hi, I'm Kendall. I'm from the Twin Cities area. I'm a customer success manager with Riverside, and I work with Minnesota, Illinois, and Iowa, so Midwest gang, and I'm really excited to be here. I used to be a special education resource teacher in the Minneapolis area. I taught for 4 years with kindergarten, first and second grade students in a resource setting, setting 1 and 2, which means that all of my students spent less than half essentially of their day in my classroom, no more than that. And so, I also want to recognize the privilege that I had as a special education teacher to really have a lot of time to work one-on-one with students on their SEL needs. And this is important to me because so many times I found myself, when I didn't focus on SEL with my kids, when I had them in that small group setting, then I found myself putting out a lot of fires and being reactive to their needs rather than fireproofing them and being, proactive. And just as it's the job of all teachers to prepare our students to go out into the world and, have skills in all areas, a huge part of my job was to prepare my students to be able to enter the general education setting and have the SEL tools that they needed in order to be successful there. So I hope that can be a helpful perspective too, as we're talking about this and how SEL is so important for them to be successful even academically too in their classroom.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful, Kendall, because I was a general education teacher for kindergarten, not first grade, kindergarten, 4th and 5th grade. And my school did not have SEL in place. And it was detrimental to them, both emotionally, but also academically. And so I'm really excited to kind of hear what you all are able to do in the classroom and what, I think we should have done in my schools, the schools I taught at, to be able to prepare students for more long-term success. So really thrilled to have the three of you here today to share some of your experiences. Before we get started with further discussions, we had a couple folks drop in what they're currently using and dropped in a note to say hi. So Leela said she was a school psychologist from New York. Leela, we're so excited to have you join us today. Barbara said that she uses Paths daily in the classrooms, which is great program. And Barbara, thank you for sharing that. We're excited to hopefully get to pick some of your best practices as well later on. And then Eleanor shared that she works in early at Head Start and does the ages and stages social emotional screening for all the children. So those are some of the resources and programs that folks have in place currently. Crystal said she's a second step at K-8 schools. So it sounds like there is a wide variety of programs and practices in place, which is fantastic. And I'm so grateful that we're starting to get to a point where we are actually thinking about how to support students on a daily basis in the school setting and thinking about how to understand what their specific social emotional needs are and how to differentiate instruction accordingly. So I think the first thing that I'm really curious to talk to you all about is, what does SEL even mean? This is a word that has gotten thrown around, especially since the start of COVID. And we have so many different understandings of what social emotional learning means and student well-being means. And so would love to get your perspectives, like, what does this mean and what are we even trying to do with SEL? Whoever wants to kick it off first.
Yeah, I can start. It makes me think of us as adults, right? And how when we are dysregulated as adults, we don't want to do our chores either. We don't want to do what we need to do. It's hard to go to work if we're feeling emotional or anxious or stressed. And I really think there's a clear connect with kids in that way too, where when they're not feeling calm, when they're not feeling safe, or they're not feeling heard, it's a lot harder for them to learn. So I think, as we are in a world now where there's a lot more stressors than there ever has been before, I think we're starting to realize that we need to address emotional needs before academic needs can be touched. So that's kind of where I go.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, if a student hasn't had any food since the prior school day or hasn't been able to get a full night's sleep due to factors outside of school, that's going to take a toll on not just their physical well-being, but also their emotional well-being and how they present in the classroom. So staying tuned into those variables is going to be important, just as we understand the full picture of a student, right? And specifically in pre-K, the SEL objectives that we were trying to achieve were helping students to learn to manage their emotions and their actions and help them to establish and maintain positive relationships, both with their classmates and with teachers and adults, and effectively participate in group settings. And so those were foundational items to set them up for success with regards to collaborating with others and learning how to appropriately express themselves. So in the context of, again, that early childhood classroom, that was ultimately the goal we were trying to achieve.
Well, and also I think beyond just that foundational piece, and somebody mentioned this earlier, but our part of our job as educators is to make sure that we are helping students become contributing members of society, right, at post high school graduation. So no matter what they choose to do out in the world as they are young adults, we need to help guide them so that they can contribute and function in society. And part of that is getting along with others, having emotional awareness, having empathy for other people around you, and just understanding that not everybody has to be exactly the same, and accepting each other's differences and embracing each other's strengths, and all of those things that we just need to do to get along as a society. And so whereas there is a lot of formal SEL curriculum out there, as I mentioned earlier, it's just part of what we've always done as educators, weaving that into our classroom. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal block of time that we spend. It may be just as simple as having a morning meeting with your class and kids sharing a few things or celebrating something that somebody had a success in over the week, whether it was something small or big, or all of those things aid in the social emotional development us as community members in our schools and our larger communities outside of the school.
I think that's such a good, oh, go ahead, Kendall, I'm sorry.
it makes me think about how Tina's totally preaching to the choir, and that like we all know how important it is. You know, we have curriculums that we can use. It's awesome. But at the end of the day, it's not always about following a lesson plan. It's modeling. It's helping them reframe. It's taking a few minutes to talk. Because I just remember as a teacher being asked, you know, what curriculum do you use? And sometimes when I was working with a group of kids with really diverse needs, a curriculum or a lesson wouldn't meet their needs. And sometimes I just needed to come down to their level and discuss and model, like Tina was saying. You know, sometimes it's not as simple as here's the answer.
Yeah, I think those are such good points, because I think so often in the classroom we get focused on the next benchmark assessment or the next score or getting your child to the next grade. And in reality, I think, Tina, what you said about we are at our core as educators supporting children to become citizens of the world. And whether that means that they're on a college track or they're on a career track or they're somewhere in between, we are preparing them to be able to make an income for themselves down the road. And so that, like, thinking about that has really helped me reframe like what SEL means, that it's, yes, it's so important to make sure that kids have the food the food that they need and the clothes that they need and the environment at home that they need. But there's also a huge component that's about teaching students to have confidence in themselves, teaching them to understand their strengths, teaching them to self-regulate their emotions and be able to actually engage in interpersonal relationships with others. And those are such like key components, like every action in the classroom contributes or doesn't contribute to supporting students developing into those global citizens. I think that's such a good point. So how, I think, and we were starting to touch on this, you know, there are the formal curriculums that so many schools have in place now, which is fantastic. What are some best practices that you all use to infuse this into throughout the day? We know that teachers, especially in general education, are limited by time and resources to get through all of the curriculum in an hour or in the school day. How do you infuse some of these SEL practices so that your students are getting the touch points and the practices that they need in order to develop some of these skills? What did y'all do in the classroom?
Yeah, so for me, while some lessons would be dedicated to social emotional learning objectives through means like read alouds and circle time, for the most part, I viewed SEL as something that we addressed throughout the entire school day, exactly like what you're saying. And so a lot of our conversations would be around making responsible decisions or safe choices and understanding how our actions were impacting those around us. So for students who either needed just quiet time away from others or who needed time to cool off after a heated interaction with another student, in my classroom, I actually had a dedicated reflection center, and it was off to the side, kind of like by where my desk was, but also not too close to my desk. So they actually had some, you know, time alone. I had sensory items there that could appeal to a variety of senses, like tubes filled with water and glitter, Play-Doh, but also had visual cues that students could point to in order to effectively describe their emotions when I would check in with them. So, you know, there'd be like an angry face and they could just point to that if they couldn't articulate how they were feeling at the time, especially because they were 4 and 5 years old. So they were just learning some of that vocabulary too. And I had a tattle teddy as a form of self-regulation. So it was like teddy bear pinned to the wall, like a 2D printout teddy bear pinned to the wall. And students could go tell Tattle Teddy in the reflection center what was upsetting them instead of lashing out at others, right? And I actually had a student go tell on me to Tattle Teddy during one of my observations because I didn't call on him right away during circle time, but he was able to take whatever time he needed to cool off and was able to rejoin his designated spot around the circle when he was ready. So those were just some ways that we incorporated it separate from like formal lesson plans.
I love that, actually, because those are skills, like those are strategies that even as an adult you can incorporate on a daily basis, you know, like those are strategies that will be lifelong, that will help that student for life. What great ideas.
We all need a title teddy, right?
We all need a title teddy. Put it right here next to me.
So my students were a little bit older than Ashley's. For the majority of my teaching time, I spent in like 4th and 5th and 6th grade. So I always started out my year with giving students ownership on what our classroom rules were going to be and what they expected from themselves and others. And we took really the whole first week of school to go through that. So what did they think was important to make our classroom feel safe, to run properly, and things like, you had to be able to raise your hand and say something without somebody criticizing you, or, you had to show respect and things like that. And so we would, I would give the students some ownership on what the classroom rules were. At my school too, we also, we implemented a PBIS structure, positive behavior intervention, and we had our school mascot was the bear, and bear stood for belonging, empathy, academics, and responsibility. So the school really, as a whole community, focused on those things, and we as a school every month say, this month we're talking about belonging, and if the principal would stop our students in the hall, or me as the teacher, and say, this month we're working on belonging, or this month we're working on empathy, what does that mean? The student would have to say, this is what it means. And then the principal would go a step farther and say, what does it look like when you see somebody showing empathy? What does that sound like? Have you seen anybody in the building this week showing empathy? Have you shown empathy to anybody? So really drove those values home to the students. So as a school community and outside of the school community as well, we shared that with the parents and asked students to, show those values outside of school and have parents help model that at home. So those were just ways as a community we did that. I also would do what we called roses and thorns in my classroom. And so when we would have our beginning or end of the day, I would say, does anybody have any roses they want to share today, like something positive? And then, did anybody have any thorns? And it could be something super small, or it could be a big deal. And I also let kids like put in a box anonymously because, not everybody's comfortable sharing that. And so I could read a rose that happened to somebody, or a thorn that they maybe needed help with, or advice, or just something that they wanted to say was happening. So all of those things just sort of helped. But for me, giving the students some ownership, and then they would really take each other to task. They would say, we agreed that you would do this in the class and you're not doing that now. And so it sort of took the policing away from me, and they sort of helped each other through that.
That's fantastic, because it's also teaching students to be able to confront and give feedback to their fellow peers if they're, and hold each other accountable, but in a supportive and safe and loving way. I love that, Tina. Kendall, what about what practices did you have in like a special education setting that you think would be applicable to more of a general education setting?
Yeah, in my setting, a lot of our SEL work focused on social skills and self-regulation, and self-regulation being the biggest one. And oftentimes, the way that you are able to very obviously see a need for self-regulation work is through student behavior. But that can, of course, be like so subjective, and you can't handle all behavior in the same way. So something that was really important to me, first of all, was taking care of my own well-being. Oftentimes, I really had to hold space for some really big feelings and really big traumas from my students. And that was significantly harder to do on days where I hadn't taken time for myself. It's important for me to remember as a teacher that my needs are important. I know we all want to stay late. I know we all want to come in early, but at the end of the day, you need to take care of yourself. So that was a really big thing for me that I think everyone needs to take time for. And then also with my students, I use something called collaborative and proactive solutions, which was born out of the idea that every behavior can be explained by an unlearned skill. So it was really taking a lot of one-on-one time with students to say, okay, here's the problem. The problem is every time we start our writing assignment in Gen Ed, you walk to the back of the classroom and start pacing. And kind of turning it to the student and saying, this is key. can you help me understand why that's what you do at that time? And giving the kid some time to think about why they're having that experience. And for this student I'm thinking of, it was because his desk was a mess and he could never find his writing notebook. So he didn't want to even touch it. It was so overwhelming to him. So he would just withdraw. So a lot of my time was spent, helping the students solve their own regulation struggles, and then guiding them through how can they articulate that to their gen ed teachers. I'm sorry if this is kind of long-winded, but we had a behavior dean at my school who would get called in when students were having a hard time in general education. And what we found is, that's a great Band-Aid. It's a great temporary solution, but with the kid who does that same behavior every single day, it's kind of just putting out the fire and putting out the fire. So something that we tried was, instead of having the behavior dean come and take the kid out and talk about a problem they weren't even there to witness, we would have the behavior dean come in and cover the class for 5 minutes while the teacher stepped out with a student and did that collaborative proactive solution model. Even if it didn't get resolved there, it was like, oh my gosh, I get this one-on-one time with my teacher, just 5 minutes. I know that you're gonna say, that could happen all day long, I'll always be pulled out. But there's so much more to the kid to be heard and seen by their classroom teacher, and it was less punitive. So
that is huge, because I think core to all of this, like listening to all of your practices that you shared, is building a culture of trust for your students. And I think that it's so easy, specifically as we're trying to help students grow academically and provide them with the academic resources they need, to forget that not all students may feel the trust and the safety to be able to learn how to self-regulate, or be able to learn how to gain confidence, or be able to try something new and fail. And I think that, like, those key practices, I had a colleague one time, and I thought this was a brilliant idea, who had, I think this was a fifth grade classroom, who had journals for all of her students, and she would give them time to journal throughout the day, and then she would read them and respond. And it took a lot of work on her end to just like be able to even write like a quick note, but it created this confidential trust between every student and the teacher, so that they could talk about things that were really on their mind, or share something that they were struggling with, and knew that they had a safe place to turn to. And I think those are like that element of trust is a key foundation for any sort of growth, whether it's social emotional learning or academic growth in the classroom.
I think sometimes students don't know that they can ask for certain types of help too, or at least that was my experience. A student with the messy writing desk, he was like, well, I don't have time to clean out my desk. And I said, well, why don't you ask the teacher if you can clean out your desk during writing time? And he said, well, then I wouldn't be writing. I said, you're not writing anyway. You're pacing, so just ask. And he asked his teacher, can I clean it out and organize it during writing? And she said yes. And then he was able to participate from that point on. So sometimes they need to be told, you can ask for help, and this is what it sounds like to ask for help, and this is what it, and with that journaling practice, I just imagine that would make them feel so seen.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a really good question a couple of comments have come in the chat that I'd love to share out. Crystal said that she also had a tattle monster in her class, which I love. She also realized that. So that was a great. But we had a question come in about, and I think this kind of ties into some of the things that we've started to bring up, but like, how do you help students that have specific learning needs or specific, cultural differences, whether they're from an ESL background or something like that, or, maybe a student with an IEP that has different learning needs? Like, how do you support them with developing those social emotional skills in a special ed setting, but then also within the context of a larger classroom?
Yeah, it's a good question. We always did kind of like a needs assessment. So I would there's a form for it, but you can do it kind of informally too. I want you to try to think about what you're seeing and what it could mean. So a lot of times we have this thing in special ed, like what came first, the learning difficulty or the behavior? So are you seeing the behavior in the classroom because they have a learning difficulty and they are acting in a way to remove themselves from having to do the activity that's hard? Or has their behavior got in the way of their learning? They don't have a learning difficulty, they just have missed so much. And now it's hard because of that reason. So I think if you can kind of get to the root of why, you know, is this behavior happening because they are trying to escape, or are they trying to gain something? It kind of goes, I'm kind of getting into like function of behavior, but I think you talk to the student. I think you talk to the student and you really try to find out, you know, you say, I noticed this behavior is happening. It worries me because it affects you in this way or your classmates in this way. And can you help me understand what that might be about? That is really hard though, to know, you know, is it a learning deficit that's making them shut down, or is it an external influence, you know?
And with ESL students, I think we take it, sorry, I'm so sorry. I think we need to take it one step further, even with, is it a learning issue, a behavior issue, or is it a language? Is it a lack of confidence with language? And I think that differentiator with specifically with EL students is, you know, how do we identify whether they need language support or learning support?
Well, and I also think Kendall mentioned, you know, talk to the student. I know that I had students, I'm thinking about two of my students actually, that it wasn't an academic issue, but they were so disruptive in my classroom. And finally, I was just like, what can I do? And this one young lady said to me, Mrs. Jordan, I can't sit for as long as I need to sit. I just can't. And I looked at the seating chart in my classroom and she was like up by the front of the room. And so I said, well, if I move you to the back of the room, can you still see the board? Yes. I said, great, let's move you to the back of the room. When you need to stand, you can stand. So she, for the whole year, wanted to be in the back of the room. She would stand up, she would rock back and forth, she would kick her, but she was in the back of the room and she was fully engaged. When I asked her questions, she was listening to what I was doing. She needed to move. And her need to move was disrupting my whole class, but it was disrupting it because I had her like in the middle of the classroom.
And they are so much more adaptable than we think, the other kids.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and you know, I remember visiting my own children's classrooms once, and there was a little boy who just blurted out like in the middle all the time. He had Tourette's, and not all the parents were looking around, and the kids were like, it's just Max.
Yeah.
Like they totally was not even a thing. But I also used to let my students give me like little silent signals too. You know, and I would let them make it up. And it couldn't be like flailing their arms or something, but just something like, you know, this, or give me a 5 in the air or something. And when I noticed that, that meant that they needed a break, or they need whatever they needed with that signal. And they just, I would connect with them and like give them a nod, and then they could take care of whatever they needed to. And it didn't have to be anybody else's business, but I saw the signal and then they could do what they needed to do.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of what you both said, I think part of SEL is adapting the physical environment and, you know, putting familiar things around like the walls or in the classroom library that reflect the lived experiences of our students, right? So, you know, having their family structure reflected in books, or, you know, in early childhood, we'd have the pictures of families up on the walls anyway to help it feel like a safe space. But, you know, just I think that highlights the importance of just being really tuned in, like you all are saying, to who our students are as people and being responsive to that. And, you know, it probably will look a little bit different year over year because you're going to have different students, but adapting the physical environment just the same that we do with some of these, you know, emotional learning concepts.
And don't be afraid, like Tina was talking about doing, don't be afraid to give something different to one student that the other student doesn't get. Because I would say all the time to my students, were like, well, how come he's allowed to sit on a wobble chair and I have to sit on a stationary chair? And I'd say everyone gets what they need, you know, and you can explain that to kids too and say, you focus just fine without that. And I do want to also just say, for anyone that was curious about that needs assessment, or that collaborative, proactive problem solving model, there's a really good book called Lost at School. And it's all about the troublemakers, right? The kids that get labeled as the troublemakers, like Tina was saying, that you just can't figure out, and you're like, what do you need? And the book talks about, it has a lot of stories, but it also has a lot of practical applications for how you do what Tina did, which is how you get to the bottom of the problem. and reach those individuals. So just wanted to share that.
No, I'm so glad. Thank you, Kendall. I'm going to have to read that one. I haven't read that one yet.
It's really good.
Yeah, and it's you know, I've been thinking a lot as I'm listening to y'all talk about how, as an educator, I feel like we know students' scores and standards like the back of our standards mastery, like the back of our hands. Like we can tell you, Adrian doesn't know these standards, Susie doesn't know these standards, Louisa doesn't know these standards, and to be able, I'm almost thinking like to flip our mentality in the classroom of focusing first, like being able to tell you what every student needs from a social emotional perspective and trusting that the academic growth will follow. Because I think that you don't like, there are so many good teachers out there, and I think we can trust the lessons and a lot of the academic curriculum and the growth measures and benchmarks that we have in place. But until we have that solid foundation of practices that create cultures where students feel okay to learn those social emotional skills, we're never going to see that academic growth that we want to see.
Mm-hmm.
No,
yeah, and I
and
like to relate it to, you know, like adults, right? Like if we're experiencing a traumatic situation or, you know, experiencing a lot of different just inputs in general, it's probably could be hard for even us to retain information. So if students are coming to our classrooms with a lot of these different, you know, again, inputs affecting their ability to be fully present, then they're not going to retain any of that material. So, you know, you could teach the full, you know, the full content that's planned for the day, but if the student isn't mentally and physically able to be fully there, then, you know, we're not really promoting that growth, right? Like I think what you just said is so foundational to everything else that we do. So.
Well, and I also just want to say that I am so happy as an educator that this is becoming more like mainstream and forefront. I mean, I think for sure Kendall and I came from big urban districts, and like I said, most of my students were living below the poverty level, and so all of those things were things that I as an educator got training in because my students needed it, and the majority of our population were dealing with bigger than life problems sometimes. But that doesn't mean that if you're in a suburban district that stuff isn't still needed. And I think sometimes we assume that because these students are coming from, you know, families that are apparently stable and they're financially sound and all of those things, that everything's okay. But it's not always, and it's not always stuff that's related to those bigger social problems. Like I'm the mom of a dyslexic child, and she went to a very high achieving suburban school district, right? For her to say, I need help when she was in that environment was a really, really scary thing for her and caused some emotional distress. So teaching her and working with her teachers on how to help her be confident in saying, I need help, and to advocate for herself in that setting was something that like her teachers didn't always think about, because you just assume, well, our population just doesn't need that. Well, yes, everybody needs that. We all do as humans. And I think if the past few years with COVID taught us anything, it's that we weren't all equipped to deal with some of that. And we can't just assume that everybody's okay. You know, again, it's just good skills for life.
The advocacy part is so big, Tina, because I think what I saw, I also taught in very low income urban districts, and my kids didn't know how to advocate for themselves. And then where they got to college or post-secondary education, and they struggled. Because like when I think about going into college, or when I was having a hard time academically, I was at, you know, tutoring or at office hours and advocated for what I needed from that professor. But so many of the kids that I taught like had never experienced an opportunity to actually learn how to articulate what they needed and advocate for it. And it was so painful to watch them really struggle down the road because they had missed that opportunity of gaining those skills. One
So
question
okay, real quick, like in pre-K, one of the objectives is actually like learning to independently brush your teeth, right? Like to me, this is also a key, like we've all said, foundational part of that development. Like I feel like almost everything does hinge on, you know, having that safe space, that secure, like social emotional baseline from which to be able to layer on every other objective, you know? So yeah, I this totally resonates with me.
Ashley, this might be a good question for you. Someone just asked this really great question. She works with children from birth to 3 years old and was wondering how to help parents kind of understand the different ways that children are beginning to name and use their emotions, and like what tips you might have for working with parents and helping parents understand supporting how to best support their children.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And ultimately, parents are such important partners, right? With especially like in those early, I mean, in any classroom, but especially in the early years, right? When, you know, it's imperative that we're reinforcing the concepts that we're teaching in the classroom. So I would say, like, one, keeping open lines of communication. So what I always had was a parent newsletter of sorts that gave like prompts that parents could talk about with their children at home that kind of piggybacked off of some of the SEL concepts we were discussing in the classroom. And I also think teaching parents how to do things like positive narration when they notice things that are really healthy behaviors with their students, right? Like, you know, I noticed you doing X, Y, Z, and just like providing that positive reinforcement and consistent language with what's being used in the school setting too. So I don't know if you guys have other best practices to add on.
I was going to say to giving them names for their emotions. You know, there's happy, sad, angry, but there's also more complex emotions too. And even though they're young, they can pick up on that too. You know, are you feeling sadness? Or are you feeling shame? Or are you feeling tired? You know, because, you know, tired, ashamed, nervous, those can feel very similar, you know, so just giving them different names and asking them questions and modeling with that narration that you're talking about too, I think can be really powerful, even if they're not even speaking yet, especially if they're not speaking yet.
Well, and this seems like such a simple method, but I don't know, it always worked with my kids when they were little, but when they would have like their freak out moments, you know, when they're 3 years old and they're toddlers and they don't really know what those emotions are, I would say, okay, we're going to count to 10 and then you can. And that's such a basic, right? But I would say, okay, let's count to 10. And we'd count to 10 together. And usually by that time, they weren't screaming or crying or something anymore. And then you could calmly say, okay, now talk to me about what's happening. Because sometimes when they get in that emotional, then they sort of spiral, right? So just giving them that count to 10. And it seems like such a simple thing to do. And it doesn't mean they're not sad anymore or they're not nervous anymore, but at least they have a little bit more calmness to try to name it, you know?
Yeah, they can't process when they're in that heightened stress response.
That's a good tip for adults too, by the way.
Right?
And I do definitely sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. One thing I forgot to mention is another tactic, you know, especially for that 0 to 3 age range, is some of those visual cues I'd have in the reflection center, I also provided to parents at home so students could have a consistent way of expressing themselves. So think of it like, you know, if you've ever been in a doctor's office or a hospital and there's like the 0 to 10 scale of emotions, or, I mean, in that case, it's usually like pain or something. But, you know, providing cues like that at home students can point to, again, as they're developing the appropriate vocabulary to express their feelings, usually helps to prevent a lot of the escalated behaviors, because students don't usually lash out unless they don't feel heard or they don't have that like self-regulation, and those visual cues are a way to help them express their feelings and self-regulate before it gets to that boiling point, you know. So that would be my recommendation as well.
Can I share one thing on that note? Okay. I'm sure many of you are familiar with zones of regulation, but I had a student who would come to me for breaks but not be ready to talk right away. And we used a color-coded little system. I had these little lights that stuck on the wall, and I put red, green, yellow, and blue tissue paper over them. And when he came in the room, he would silently let me know how he was doing by pressing one of the lights on. And I knew that when the red light was on, he wasn't ready to talk. But when the green light was on, or the yellow, he was getting there, right? And then he hit the green, and then he would know, it would be like him saying, okay, please help me now. So that can be another thing, especially if your kids aren't talking yet, so that they can let you know what state they're in, even 100%. Though you know what state they're in.
100%. That's amazing, because it's also teaching them, like, I mean, this is a silly example, but some adults don't like to talk in the morning, and it's teaching them to put down, like, you know, to advocate for themselves and say, this is what I personally need right now, and I can communicate it in a way that other people can respect what I need. I think that's huge. Really quickly, one of the attendees just dropped 2 other resources into the chat and that I wanted to share out. So there's a good book called Negotiating Opportunities by Jessica Colarco. And we can send this out in a follow-up email as well, but Negotiating Opportunities. And then the Sesame Street and Communities has some good newsletters for folks to be able to use and send out to their families as well. So Sesame Street has so many great resources, but their newsletters, I think, are supposed to help with parent communication as well. I can't believe we're already at time. This has been such a great conversation, but and I know we could keep talking about it for hours and hours and hours, but I've learned so much from listening to all of you share your best practices. Any concluding thoughts as we wrap this up about SEL, student well-being, just tips for educators? Any last takeaways or concluding thoughts?
I just want to reiterate something that Kendall said, because she said that we have to start taking care of ourselves as educators. And I think that's something that's really, really important to remember. We as educators take on the stress of our students, and if we're not okay, that conveys itself in the classroom. And you guys, we're losing a lot of people in our profession to burnout, and we love our students and we want to do the best for them, but you can't unless you take care of yourself too. So I think that just wanted to reiterate that Kendall said that, and just remember that, take care of yourselves.
100%.
Yeah.
You can't do anything from yourself unless you are in the right good space.
And there will always be more to do, you know. So, you know, if you're always working after hours, they'll always know that you're willing to do so. And yeah, take care of yourself, and also, you know, talk to each other. When I was a teacher, I had a hard time sharing with my fellow teachers how I was feeling, because I didn't want to bring them down, you know. But I think there's a way that you can do it that makes each other feel seen too. And kind of, you know, once you start talking about that, you realize that taking 10 minutes a day to talk to your class and work on these things is not going to have a dramatic impact on, it's not going to cause learning loss, but not addressing it at all will. So, you know, be patient with yourself and give yourself grace and talk to each other.
I think have fun with your students sometimes. I think we focus so much on all the stuff that's going on, we forget to have fun with the kids.
100%. And I would also just add in there that I'd encourage you to think about what's in your locus of control and run with it, even if your school doesn't have a formal SEL program or curriculum. So, you know, as we talked about today, how does your classroom's physical environment support an emotionally safe space for all students? How do you promote supportive relationships in all classroom interactions and spotlight healthy behaviors and responsible decision making with positive narration or those other tactics? And all of those things can happen separate from an SEL curriculum and can happen through the course of the day-to-day. So I would just encourage you to think about how you want to reflect it in your own classrooms and run with it.
I love that. And flip the script. You know, I think we're in a time of disruption in education, and so I think let's disrupt it for good, and let's think about how we can. You know, academics are obviously very important, but no child is going to reach their true potential unless they have the skills that they need to be able to be that global citizen that Tina talked about earlier. So Wow, thank you all so much. This was really, really, really impactful, and I learned so much, and I hope our attendees did as well. But really appreciate you taking the time, both Tina, Kendall, and Ashley to join us from Riverside, and then all of our educators that are online to join us today. We hope this was helpful for you as you think about preparing for the next school year. And if you enjoyed it, we hope you'll be able to join us for our final 3 For Educators by Educators conversations in the upcoming 3 weeks. But with that, I'll close this out for today, and have a great afternoon, everyone, and a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.